On the morning of my 18th birthday, I thought my parents were taking me to a celebratory breakfast. Instead, they drove me to a county courthouse filed for emergency adult conservatorship and smiled at the judge while declaring me mentally incompetent. They wanted to steal the $2.5 million trust my grandfather left me. They thought I was just the dumb, broken kid they had always told me I was. They had no idea I walked into that courtroom carrying a manila envelope that was about to freeze every single bank account they had ever touched. My name is Liam. I am 34 years old now, and I work as a forensic auditor specializing in corporate embezzlement. But to understand how I learned to hunt down financial thieves for a living, you have to understand what happened on the very morning I officially became an adult. Let me paint the picture of what my 18th birthday looked like. I woke up in the small guest bedroom of my parents' pristine suburban house. I had packed a small duffel bag expecting a weekend trip to a lake cabin. My mother, Barbara, had told me the night before to dress nicely. "Wear a tie," she said. "We are doing something important for your birthday." My father, Richard, waited in the driveway gripping the steering wheel of his luxury SUV. He did not say happy birthday when I climbed into the back seat. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw tight and his hands gripping the leather wheel. We did not go to a restaurant. We did not go to a car dealership. We drove downtown and parked in the gray concrete structure next to the county courthouse. When I asked why we were there, my father snapped at me to keep my mouth shut and walk faster. We walked into Department 47, the probate court. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind me, sealing me inside a nightmare I did not even know was happening. I took a seat in the second row. A few rows back sat my older brother, Connor. Connor was 24 at the time, the absolute golden child of the family. He wore a tailored navy blue suit, his hair perfectly parted. He did not even look at me. He was too busy smirking at his phone, texting his fiancée, Chloe. Connor worked at a wealth management firm and drove a car that cost more than most people make in 5 years. I was the exact opposite. I wore hand-me-down shirts from a thrift store and spent my time taking apart old computers in the garage. My family always made sure I knew my place. Connor was the success story. I was the embarrassment. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Thomas Miller took the bench. He looked over his reading glasses down at a thick stack of papers. "Your Honor, my parents' attorney, a man named David, stood up. We are here today on an emergency petition for adult guardianship over Liam. As he turns 18 today, he legally assumes control over his own affairs. However, as outlined in our filing, my clients are seeking immediate and full conservatorship over his medical and financial decisions due to his severe instability and absolute inability to manage his own life." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Emergency guardianship, conservatorship, severe instability. I looked at my mother. She was sitting perfectly straight, wearing her Sunday church dress, clutching a designer handbag in her lap. She did not look at me. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What is he talking about?" I asked, my voice cracking out loud in the quiet courtroom. "I do not need a guardian. I am going to community college next month." The judge banged his gavel and ordered me to sit down and remain silent. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and severe annoyance. I sank back into the hard wooden bench, my mind racing. Why were they doing this? I knew they did not like me. I knew I was the black sheep. But taking away my basic human rights on my 18th birthday felt like an extreme level of cruelty, even for them. And then the attorney handed the judge a secondary document, and the pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with horrifying clarity. "Your Honor," the attorney continued, smoothing his expensive tie, "the urgency of this petition stems from a pressing financial matter. The respondent's late grandfather Harrison established a private trust fund currently valued at approximately $2.5 million. That trust vests fully and completely to Liam today on his 18th birthday. Given his documented psychological issues, releasing this massive amount of capital to him would be catastrophic. His parents, Richard and Barbara, are asking to be appointed permanent financial conservators to protect the estate from his reckless behavior. $2.5 million. My grandfather Harrison had died 7 months earlier. He was a quiet, hard-working man who built a successful construction supply business from the ground up. He saw right through my father's obsession with country clubs and luxury cars. Grandfather Harrison used to sit with me on his back porch and tell me I had a good head on my shoulders. He told me to trust numbers because numbers never lie. I never knew he left me anything. I certainly never knew he bypassed his own son, Richard, entirely to leave his life savings directly to me. My parents did not bring me to court to protect me. They brought me to court to steal my inheritance. If the judge granted the conservatorship, Richard and Barbara would have total legal control over the $2.5 million. I would be locked out of my own life, reduced to a ward of the state, while they drained my grandfather's money to fund their lavish lifestyle and pay off their country club debts. The judge flipped through the thick file. "I see you have provided psychiatric evaluations, Mrs. Vance. Would you care to take the stand to elaborate on your son's condition for the court record?" My mother stood up. She walked to the witness stand, placed her right hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. She adjusted the microphone and looked at the judge with tears pooling in her eyes. It was a flawless, terrifying performance. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling perfectly. "This breaks a mother's heart. But my husband and I have no choice left. Liam has always been deeply troubled. We have tried everything to save him from himself." She proceeded to assassinate my character for the next 20 minutes. Every normal teenage struggle, every minor argument, every moment of isolation was twisted into a clinical diagnosis of severe mental incompetence. When Liam was 15, he locked himself in his room for 3 days, she testified, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She conveniently left out that I was grieving my grandfather's initial stroke and that she had screamed at me for crying because it was ruining her neighborhood dinner party. "He is financially reckless," she continued, shaking her head tragically. "He cannot hold a job. He is completely detached from reality. We tried to get him help. We paid for expensive therapists. We tried to guide him, but he is simply not capable of surviving in the real world on his own. If you let him have access to that money, he will destroy himself. He will be dead or living on the streets in a month. We just want to protect him." The attorney submitted a heavy stack of medical records to the clerk. I stared at the papers in absolute horror. They were evaluations from a private psychiatrist I had seen exactly twice when I was 16. A psychiatrist my parents had hired who happened to be a close friend from their Sunday church congregation. The reports claimed I suffered from severe oppositional defiant disorder, extreme impulsivity, and a dangerous inability to process logical decisions. The documents were completely fabricated. They were a carefully constructed paper trail designed years in advance for this exact day. I looked at my father, Richard, sitting at the petitioner's table. He was staring at the judge, nodding solemnly, playing the role of the burdened, heartbroken father. I remembered how he had yelled at me just last week, telling me I was a useless burden who would never amount to anything compared to my brother Connor. Now here he was, sitting in a court of law trying to legally declare me incompetent so he could take my money. I turned my head and looked at Connor in the gallery. My older brother caught my eye. He gave me a slow, arrogant smirk, leaned back in his chair, and went back to texting Chloe. He knew. Of course he knew. He was a junior wealth manager at a downtown firm. He probably helped my parents set up the hidden offshore accounts to receive the trust funds once they secured the guardianship. They had likely been planning this theft since the day my grandfather passed away. My mother continued her testimony, painting a picture of a household held hostage by my supposed erratic behavior. "We love him, Your Honor," she said, her voice breaking into a perfectly timed sob. "We just want to keep him safe. We want to manage his care and his finances so he does not ruin his future. Please do not let him destroy what his grandfather worked so hard to build." It was brilliant. It was absolutely evil and entirely brilliant. They were using the legal system, the very system designed to protect vulnerable people, as a weapon to strip away my fundamental human rights. They were going to trap me in a legal cage. If they won, I would never be able to sign a contract. I could never rent an apartment. I could never get married or touch a single dollar of my own money without their explicit legal permission. I would be their permanent prisoner, and they would be multimillionaires. The judge looked down at me from his elevated bench. His expression was stern and unreadable. The sheer volume of the paperwork my parents had manufactured was overwhelming. To the court, I was not a scared 18-year-old boy watching his family betray him. I was a liability. I was a legal problem that needed to be managed and contained. Mr. Vance, the judge, said, addressing me directly, his voice booming through the microphone. Do you have legal representation today? I stood up. My knees were shaking so badly I had to grip the heavy oak table in front of me just to stay upright. No, Your Honor, I said, my voice echoing in the large room. I did not know I was coming here today. I thought my parents were taking me out to breakfast for my birthday. A murmur ran through the courtroom gallery. My mother covered her face with her hands, pretending to cry harder at my apparent delusion. My father leaned over to his expensive lawyer and whispered something with a tight, confident smile. The judge frowned deeply and adjusted his glasses. Given the emergency nature of this petition and the substantial financial assets involved at midnight, I am inclined to grant a temporary conservatorship to your parents, pending a full evidentiary hearing. The medical documentation provided by your parents is highly concerning. I cannot in good conscience allow a $2.5 million trust to vest to a young man with this documented level of psychological instability. My heart stopped beating. Temporary conservatorship. It did not matter if it was temporary. That was the trap. Once they had the keys to the accounts, they would drain the funds immediately. They would wire the millions to offshore accounts or bury the money in shell companies managed by Connor. By the time a full evidentiary hearing happened months from now, the money would be completely gone and my life would be ruined beyond repair. I looked at the people who had raised me, the people who were supposed to protect me and love me. My mother was wiping away her fake tears, looking victorious. My father was looking at his luxury watch, eager to get to the bank before it closed. My brother was already mentally spending his cut of the cash on a new house for Chloe. They had planned this for months. They had spent thousands of dollars on fake doctors and expensive lawyers to build this trap. They had sat around the dinner table laughing and eating with me while secretly plotting to destroy my independence the moment I turned 18. They thought they had won, because they thought I was exactly what they told the world I was. A dumb, unstable kid who could not fight back. But they made one massive, fatal miscalculation. They assumed Grandfather Harrison was just a tired old man who blindly signed checks. They assumed he did not know exactly what kind of greedy, manipulative people they truly were. I took a deep, slow breath, letting the panic fade into absolute cold clarity. I reached inside the inner pocket of my cheap thrift store jacket and felt the thick, heavy manila envelope resting against my ribs. I had been carrying it with me everywhere for 2 days, ever since I received it in the mail from my grandfather's private attorney. I pulled it out and placed it firmly on the table. The loud smack of the heavy paper hitting the solid wood echoed across the silent courtroom. I do not have a lawyer, Your Honor, I said, my voice suddenly steady, cold, and clear. But I do have a letter and some financial records from my grandfather, and I think you need to read them before you hand my entire life over to the people who spent the last 3 years stealing from him. The entire courtroom froze. My father's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with sudden, genuine panic. My mother stopped crying instantly, her hands dropping from her face. Connor dropped his phone on the floor. The judge raised an eyebrow, holding his hand out toward the bailiff. "Bring that to me," he ordered. The game was about to change. The heavy manila envelope sat on the dark, polished wood of the defense table. The sound of it hitting the surface seemed to echo in the cavernous courtroom. I kept my hand pressed flat against it, feeling the thick stack of papers hidden inside. My father Richard shot out of his chair. His face was flushed a deep, angry red. He pointed a trembling finger at me and shouted to the judge that this was exactly the erratic behavior they were talking about. He claimed I was pulling a stunt. My mother Barbara gripped the edges of the witness stand, her knuckles turning white. The fake tears were entirely gone now, replaced by a cold, hard stare. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes locked on Judge Thomas Miller. The judge raised his hand, demanding silence. The courtroom fell so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents above us. The bailiff, a tall, imposing man with a silver badge pinned to his chest, walked over to my table. I slid the envelope toward him. My hands were no longer shaking. A strange calm had washed over me. The panic that had gripped my throat just moments ago was completely gone. I watched the bailiff carry the envelope up the wooden steps and hand it to the judge. Connor, my older brother, had stopped texting. He was sitting up straight in the gallery, his tailored suit suddenly looking stiff and uncomfortable. The smug smirk had vanished from his face. He leaned forward, trying to get a better look at the papers. My parents' expensive attorney, David, stood up and objected immediately. He argued that I was unrepresented and that introducing unverified documents into an emergency guardianship hearing was highly irregular. He told the court they should ignore whatever delusion I had brought with me and grant the conservatorship immediately to protect the $2.5 million trust. Judge Miller ignored him completely. He picked up a silver letter opener and sliced through the top of the manila envelope. He pulled out a thick bound stack of financial documents topped with a letter bearing the official letterhead of my grandfather's private estate attorney. The judge adjusted his reading glasses. He read the first page in absolute silence. Then he turned to the second page. The silence in the room stretched out for what felt like an eternity. I watched the color slowly drain from my father's face. He knew what was in there. Deep down, he had to know that his father, Grandfather Harrison, was too smart to let them get away with their lies forever. The judge looked up. His expression had completely transformed. The severe annoyance he had directed at me earlier was entirely gone. In its place was a look of absolute disgust directed straight at my parents. The judge cleared his throat and leaned toward his microphone. He held up the first piece of paper. "This is a sworn affidavit from Arthur Pendleton, the late Harrison Vance's personal attorney and forensic accountant," the judge stated. "It is dated 3 weeks before Harrison Vance passed away. Accompanying this affidavit are 72 pages of private financial audits, bank statements, and copies of canceled checks." The judge's eyes pierced right through my father. "Mr. Vance, would you care to explain why there are 14 checks written from your elderly father's retirement accounts to the Oak Ridge Country Club, all bearing a signature that clearly does not match his?" My father physically stumbled backward. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The attorney, David, looked at my father with wide, shocked eyes, suddenly realizing his clients had lied to him. My mother gripped the microphone on the witness stand and stammered that it was a massive misunderstanding. She claimed Grandfather Harrison had authorized those payments to help with family expenses. She told the court his mind was failing him at the end of his life, and he simply forgot what he had signed. Judge Miller slammed his gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. "Do not insult my intelligence." "Mrs. Vance," he thundered, "according to this forensic audit, your father-in-law was of perfectly sound mind. He hired an independent investigator because he noticed substantial funds missing from his primary accounts." The judge flipped to another page, holding it up high for the court to see. "The audits show that over the course of his final 18 months, you and your husband systematically drained $400,000 from his liquid assets. There are unauthorized wire transfers to a shell corporation managed by your other son, Connor." At the sound of his name, Connor jumped out of his seat in the gallery. His face went pale and he looked frantically at the courtroom doors as if he was calculating how fast he could run. The judge pointed a stern finger at him and ordered the bailiff to ensure no one left the room. Connor sank back down into his seat, his pristine image crumbling in real time. My parents had used him to hide the stolen money. They had funneled my grandfather's hard-earned savings into hidden accounts and fake business ventures just to fund their illusion of absolute wealth. Judge Miller picked up a handwritten letter that was attached to the back of the audit report. I recognized the neat, precise handwriting instantly. It was Grandfather Harrison. The judge read the letter aloud to the silent court. To whoever is presiding over my grandsons, fate, please read these documents carefully. My son Richard and his wife Barbara are thieves. They have used my declining physical health to forge my signature and steal my retirement funds. I have secured the remaining $2.5 million in an airtight trust for my grandson Liam. Liam is a good boy. He is honest, and he is the only one in this family with a true moral compass. I know Richard and Barbara will try to take his trust. I know they will try to paint him as incompetent to gain control of the money. Do not let them. They are attempting to use the court to finish the robbery they started while I was still alive. Hearing my grandfather's words spoken out loud in that sterile courtroom broke something open inside me. I felt a hot tear slide down my cheek, but I did not wipe it away. He had seen me. He had known exactly who I was and exactly who my parents were. He had orchestrated this entire defense from beyond the grave. He knew I would not be able to fight their expensive lawyers on my own, so he handed me the ultimate weapon, the absolute truth. My mother started crying hysterically, but this time the tears were real. She begged the judge to listen to her. She pointed at me and screamed that I was a liar, that I had somehow forged the documents, that I was a disturbed child trying to ruin their perfect lives. My father tried to approach the bench, pleading that the money was his birthright and that his father had been manipulated by my lies. The attorney, David, quietly packed his briefcase and physically stepped away from my father, rapidly distancing himself from the massive financial fraud that had just been exposed. Judge Miller was having none of it. He looked at my parents with a cold fury that chilled the entire room. In all my years on the bench, I have rarely seen a more despicable abuse of the legal system, the judge said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. You came into this courtroom under the guise of concerned parents. You attempted to strip a young man of his civil liberties, lock him in a conservatorship, and ruin his reputation permanently solely to gain access to his inheritance. You committed perjury today. But more importantly, the evidence presented here suggests you have committed severe elder financial abuse and federal wire fraud. The judge did not stop there. He picked up his pen and began signing court orders with rapid, aggressive strokes. I am denying the petition for emergency guardianship over Liam Vance, effective immediately. Furthermore, based on the verified forensic audit provided by the deceased estate, I am invoking emergency judicial powers. I am ordering an immediate freeze on all personal and business bank accounts belonging to Richard and Barbara Vance. I am also freezing all accounts associated with the limited liability company managed by Connor Vance. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. My father let out a sound that was half gasp and half scream. He grabbed his chest, stumbling backward against the heavy wooden table. Freezing our accounts, he shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. You cannot do that. We have mortgages to pay. We have country club dues. We have a lifestyle to maintain. You are ruining us. My mother collapsed into the witness chair, sobbing uncontrollably, her designer makeup running down her face in dark, messy streaks. Connor was sitting in the gallery looking like he was about to be physically sick. The grand illusion was gone. The money they had stolen was completely locked. The money they planned to steal from me was entirely out of their reach. Judge Miller ignored their desperate panic. I am forwarding these documents to the district attorney and the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI, he stated firmly over the noise. You will not access a single penny of your assets until a full federal investigation is complete. If I were you, I would stop worrying about your country club dues and start looking for a very good criminal defense attorney. I stood there feeling a massive wave of relief wash over my entire body. I was safe. They were not going to lock me in a permanent conservatorship. They were not going to take my money. My grandfather had saved my life. I looked up at the judge, fully expecting him to bang his gavel and tell me I was free to go to the bank and claim my $2.5 million. But Judge Miller turned his stern gaze toward me, and my intense relief suddenly faltered. Liam, the judge, said, his voice softening slightly but remaining incredibly serious. Your grandfather loved you very much. He went to extraordinary lengths to protect you from the people sitting behind you. And because I respect his final wishes, I am going to make sure his money is protected from them as well." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you, Your Honor," I said. "I just want to take the trust and go to college. I want to start my life completely away from them." The judge sighed heavily, steepling his fingers together on the desk. "That is the exact problem, Liam. You are 18 years old. If I release $2.5 million in liquid cash to you today, you will become a walking target. Your parents are desperate. They are facing federal fraud charges and imminent bankruptcy. If you have that money, they will hound you. They will harass you. They will find a way to manipulate you, extort you, or drain you dry with frivolous lawsuits. You are young, and you do not yet have the heavy armor required to fight off vultures when they are this hungry." I stared at him, simply not understanding his logic. "But it is my money," I said, my voice trembling again. "My grandfather left it to me." "He left it for your future," the judge corrected sharply, "and I am going to ensure you actually have one. As the presiding judge over this probate case, I am amending the disbursement terms of the trust for your own ultimate protection. I am placing the $2.5 million into a locked, conditional trust. The funds will be invested securely and will accrue interest, but the principal balance will be completely frozen and legally untouchable, until when I asked, feeling the blood rush to my ears in a sudden wave of panic. Until your 30th birthday, Judge Miller stated clearly. For the next 12 years, you will not have access to a single dime of this money. You will have to work. You will have to struggle. You will have to build your own life from the ground up, just like your grandfather did. By the time you are 30, you will be a man fully capable of defending your wealth. Until then, you are entirely on your own." The judge banged his wooden gavel heavily. "We are adjourned." I stood completely paralyzed in the center of the courtroom. The bailiff began escorting my screaming parents out of the room. My father cursed my name at the top of his lungs. My mother wailed that I had destroyed the family forever. Connor bolted out the back doors without even looking back. I was completely free from their control. I had defeated their malicious plan. But as I walked out of that courthouse, stepping into the blinding afternoon sun, the brutal reality of my situation crushed me. I had a multi-million-dollar fortune with my name on it, but I could not buy a loaf of bread. I was 18 years old, officially entirely alone and completely broke. I drove straight from the courthouse back to the only home I had ever known. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel of my beat-up Honda sedan so tightly that my knuckles ached. My mind was reeling from what had just happened. I had won. I had stopped my parents from stealing my inheritance and locking me in a permanent legal cage. But as I pulled into the pristine, perfectly manicured driveway of my parents' suburban house, I did not feel like a winner. I felt like a ghost. I turned off the engine and stared at the 2-story brick house. The front lawn was flawlessly green. The flower beds were perfectly arranged. It looked like the ultimate American dream, but I knew the absolute rot hiding behind those expensive front doors. All I wanted was to walk upstairs, pack my clothes, grab my high school diploma, and leave this toxic family behind forever. I walked up the stone pathway and reached for the brass doorknob. Before my hand even touched the metal, the door violently swung open. My father Richard stood blocking the entrance. He had beaten me to the house. His tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned, and his face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked at me not like a son, but like a disease that had infected his perfect life. "I just need my clothes," I said, keeping my voice as calm as possible. "Let me get my bags, and I will never bother you again." My father stepped forward, forcing me to back away down the concrete steps. "You are not stepping 1 foot inside my house," he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "You do not have clothes here. You do not have a room here. You do not have a family here." I stood my ground on the walkway. "They are my things," I replied. Just let me grab my winter coat and my shoes." My father laughed a harsh, bitter sound that echoed across the quiet suburban street. "Your things," he mocked. "You own nothing, Liam. You think you are so smart because you handed that judge a file. You think you won. Do you have any idea what you just did to your mother and me?" The judge froze our accounts. "Every single credit card is declined. We cannot even buy groceries. We are going to lose this house, and it is entirely your fault." I looked at him in total disbelief. "It is my fault," I asked, my voice rising. "You tried to declare me mentally incompetent. You brought fake psychiatric records to court to steal my grandfather's money. You tried to take away my human rights so you could pay your country club fees. How is any of this my fault?" My father pointed a shaking finger right at my chest. "You are a selfish, ungrateful mistake," he shouted. "I should have never let you live under this roof. You are dead to us, Liam. If I ever see your face on my property again, I will call the police and tell them a trespasser is threatening my wife. Now get off my driveway before I throw you off myself." He slammed the heavy front door so hard the glass panes rattled. The deadbolt clicked into place. I stood alone on the front porch, listening to the deafening silence of the wealthy neighborhood. I had the clothes on my back. I had my cheap phone. I had my car keys. Everything else, my childhood photos, my winter jackets, my books, they were all locked inside a house I could never enter again. I spent that first night parked behind a local gas station trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. I thought the worst was over. I thought the courtroom and the physical rejection at the front door were the final blows. I had completely underestimated my mother, Barbara. I forgot that she was the vice president of the local church board and the social queen of our affluent community. She was a master of manipulation, and she was not about to let the town know she was being investigated for federal wire fraud. By Sunday morning, the rumors had already saturated the entire town. I drove my car to the large stone church I had attended since I was a child. I just wanted to speak to Pastor Thomas. I had known him for 12 years. He had baptized me. He had counseled me when my grandfather passed away. I thought if anyone would listen to the truth, it would be him. I thought he could offer some guidance, or at least a safe place to sit for a few hours. I parked in the back of the massive church lot and walked toward the main sanctuary doors. People I had known my entire life were mingling on the steps. The moment they saw me, the conversations abruptly stopped. The silence was incredibly loud. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men I had done yard work for turned their backs and looked away. The stairs were filled with heavy, judgmental disgust. I kept my head down and walked to the pastoral office at the side of the building. I knocked on the heavy wooden door. After a long moment, Pastor Thomas opened it. He was wearing his Sunday robes, his Bible tucked under his arm. But his face was completely closed off. There was no warmth in his eyes. "Pastor," I started feeling a lump form in my throat. "I really need to talk to you. Things have gotten out of control with my parents, and I have nowhere to go." Pastor Thomas stepped out of his office and pulled the door shut behind him, blocking my entry, just like my father had done. "Liam," he said, his tone perfectly even and completely devoid of compassion. "Your mother called me yesterday. She was completely heartbroken. She told me everything." I shook my head desperately. "Whatever she told you is a lie," I pleaded. "They tried to steal from me. They forged documents. The judge froze their accounts because of what they did to my grandfather." The pastor held up his hand, silencing me. "Stop," he commanded. "Your mother warned me you would say these things. She told the board how you manipulated a senile old man before he died. She explained how you managed to trick a naive judge with forged paperwork to lock up the family finances." She was sobbing, Liam. "She told us about your severe drug addiction. She told us you are completely unstable and dangerous." My jaw dropped. "Drug addiction?" I repeated, absolutely stunned. "I do not even drink alcohol. You know me. You have known me my whole life." "I thought I knew you," the pastor replied, his voice hardening. "But stealing from your own parents to feed your habits and attempting to destroy their reputation in the community is a sin I cannot ignore." Your parents are good God-fearing people who give generously to this congregation. They are victims of your greed." I stared at him, realizing the horrific scope of my mother's smear campaign. She had not just lied to him. She had laid the groundwork for this narrative for months. She had used her fake psychiatric evaluations and her position in the church to turn everyone against me before I even knew we were at war. "I do not want to see you anywhere near this property again," the pastor said, taking a step back toward his office. "We will pray for your soul, Liam. But until you return the money you stole and apologize to your mother and father, you are not welcome in this house of worship." He went inside and locked the door. I walked back to my car feeling completely numb. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from a childhood friend telling me to lose his number because he did not associate with thieves. Then another text came from the mother of a kid I used to tutor telling me to never contact them again. My mother had effectively excommunicated me from the entire town. She had entirely rewritten reality. In her version of the story, she and my father were the tragic, loving parents trying to save their severely addicted son. I was the monster who had stolen their wealth and broken their hearts. She had taken my family, my home, and now she had taken my entire community. I was completely radioactive. No one would hire me. No one would rent me a room. No one would even answer my phone calls. I was entirely isolated and completely alone. The sun began to set on Sunday evening, painting the suburban sky in beautiful shades of orange and purple. The neighborhood streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement. I drove out of the wealthy suburbs, leaving behind the large houses, the manicured lawns, and the people who had blindly accepted my mother's toxic lies. I drove until the houses gave way to strip malls and industrial parks. I eventually pulled into a massive, brightly lit Walmart parking lot right on the edge of the county line. I parked my old sedan under a flickering yellow street lamp near the back of the lot, far away from the entrance. I turned off the engine, and the silence of the car wrapped around me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I reached into my pocket and pulled out everything I owned. I had a cheap plastic wallet, my driver's license, and exactly $80 in wrinkled bills. I placed the cash on the passenger seat and stared at it. $80. I was 18 years old. On paper, according to the legal documents sitting in the county courthouse, I was a multimillionaire. I was the sole beneficiary of a $2.5 million trust fund. I was technically wealthier than everyone who had looked down on me at the church that morning. But reality is a very cruel master. The judge had locked that trust away to protect it from my parents. I could not access a single penny of the principal for another 12 long years. I could not borrow against it. I could not use it to secure an apartment. The money was absolutely useless to me right now. I looked at the $80 on the seat. That was my entire operating budget for the rest of my life. That was all I had for food, for gas, for survival. The temperature outside began to drop rapidly. A harsh wind whipped across the vast concrete parking lot, rattling the windows of my old car. I did not have a winter coat because my father had locked it inside the house. I did not have a blanket. I reached into the back seat and found an old promotional sweatshirt I had gotten from a high school track meet years ago. I put it on, zipping it all the way up to my chin, trying to trap whatever body heat I had left. I reclined the driver's seat back as far as it would go. The springs dug into my lower back. I looked out the windshield at the bright neon blue sign of the supercenter glowing against the dark night sky. Cars drove past people walking inside to buy groceries, to buy warm clothes, to buy things for their families. They were living normal lives entirely unaware of the young man freezing in the dark corner of the lot. I had never felt so profound a level of physical and emotional exhaustion. My own mother had stood in a court of law and tried to strip away my basic human rights. My own father had threatened to call the police if I tried to retrieve my winter shoes. My brother had sat there and smirked while they plotted to steal my future. And the people who had watched me grow up, the people who preached about grace and truth, had turned their backs on me without a second thought. They wanted me to break. My mother wanted me to hit rock bottom so quickly and so violently that I would come crawling back to their front door, begging for mercy. She knew I had no money. She knew I had nowhere to go. She expected me to starve out here in the cold. She expected me to call her in a few days, broken and crying, willing to sign over the trust just to get a warm bed and a hot meal. They were banking on my weakness. They were banking on the belief that I was exactly the pathetic dependent failure they had always claimed I was. I lay there in the freezing car, shivering as the night deepened. The cold seeped through the thin floorboards, chilling my bones. I stared at the $80 on the passenger seat. I stared at the heavy manila envelope sitting right next to it, the only remaining proof that my grandfather had believed in me. I was hungry. I was exhausted. I was terrified of what tomorrow would bring. But as the freezing air filled the cabin of my car, a new feeling began to rise in my chest. It was not sadness. It was not grief. It was an intense, burning, absolute rage. They took my family. They took my reputation. They took my home. But they did not take my mind. And they did not get the money. I closed my eyes, gritting my teeth against the bitter cold. I made a silent vow to myself right there in that empty, desolate parking lot. I was not going to break. I was not going to crawl back to them. I was going to survive this parking lot. I was going to stretch those $80. I was going to wait out the clock for 12 years if I had to. And when I finally came back, I was going to be a man they could never manipulate or destroy ever again. The first few weeks living in my car were a brutal lesson in human invisibility. When you do not have an address, you cease to exist in the eyes of society. I spent my nights parked in the dark corners of retail parking lots, waking up every few hours, shivering violently from the cold. My bones ached from sleeping across the uneven back seat of my sedan. Every morning I would use public restrooms to wash my face and brush my teeth, trying to scrub away the exhaustion before anyone could notice the desperate reality of my situation. I had exactly $80 to my name and a $2.5 million trust fund that I could not touch for 12 years. It was a psychological torture that my mother had completely anticipated. She was waiting for me to break. She was waiting for the cold and the hunger to crush my pride so completely that I would come crawling back to their manicured front door, willing to sign away my future just for a hot meal and a warm bed. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I knew I needed a job immediately, but I also needed a way to survive the physical reality of homelessness. That was when I found the night shift janitorial position at the local community college. It paid minimum wage, but it offered two things that were infinitely more valuable to me than money. First, it gave me keycard access to the athletic locker rooms, which meant I could take a hot shower at 4 a.m. before the students arrived. Second, the college had a policy that full-time maintenance staff received a full tuition waiver. I took the job the exact same day I applied. The work was grueling and completely devoid of dignity. While kids my age were sleeping in warm dorm rooms or staying up late with their friends, I was pushing a heavy industrial mop bucket down miles of empty fluorescent-lit hallways. I scraped chewing gum off the bottoms of lecture hall desks. I scrubbed toilets and wiped down the mirrors in the bathrooms. My hands cracked and bled from the harsh chemical cleaning supplies. My back throbbed from hauling heavy trash bags to the dumpsters behind the cafeteria. I was a ghost haunting the campus in the middle of the night, entirely unseen by the world. There were nights when the physical exhaustion was so overwhelming that I would sit down in the dark supply closet among the brooms and the bleach and seriously consider surrendering. I would hold my cheap prepaid phone in my bruised hands, staring at my mother's phone number. All I had to do was press call. All I had to do was apologize for telling the truth in court, beg for her forgiveness, and let them take the trust. The temptation to stop the pain was incredibly heavy. But every time the urge to quit threatened to break me, I would reach into my backpack and pull out the one physical item my grandfather had left me that the judge had not locked away. It was a vintage leather ledger book. The cover was worn smooth from years of use, the edges frayed and soft. My grandfather's private attorney had slipped it into the manila envelope along with the financial audits. During my 15-minute breaks, I would sit on an overturned plastic bucket in the supply closet and carefully turn the pages of that ledger. Most of the pages were filled with my grandfather's meticulous handwritten notes tracking his early business expenses and calculating the profit margins of his construction company from decades ago. But on the inside of the front cover, written in thick, dark ink, was a message he had penned specifically for me. They will use appearances to blind people. Learn to read the numbers. Numbers never lie. I traced my finger over those words again and again until they were permanently burned into my memory. My grandfather knew exactly how my parents operated. He knew that my father used his expensive suits and his luxury vehicles to project an aura of absolute success, masking the fact that he was financially drowning. He knew that my mother used her position on the church board and her perfect suburban smile to hide the fact that she was a manipulative thief. They relied on illusions to survive. They survived because people rarely look past the shiny surface. My grandfather was telling me how to beat them. He was handing me the blueprint to my own survival. I realized that sweeping floors and taking hot showers in empty locker rooms was only going to keep me alive. If I actually wanted to win, if I wanted to ensure that no one could ever use the legal or financial system to destroy me again, I needed to understand the weapon they had tried to use against me. The very next morning, after finishing a brutal 9-hour shift of scrubbing floors, I walked straight into the admissions office. I used my employee tuition waiver and enrolled in the accounting program. I did not just want to learn basic bookkeeping. I wanted to understand the absolute architecture of money. I registered for every class I could find on corporate finance, tax law, and forensic accounting. My life became a relentless, punishing cycle of extreme endurance. I would work the janitorial shift from 10 at night until 7 in the morning. I would sneak into the locker room, shower, change into clean clothes, and sleep in my car for 2 hours in the campus parking lot. Then I would sit in lecture halls with wealthy suburban kids, furiously taking notes on asset allocation and fraud examination. While my classmates were planning their weekend parties, I was studying case studies on corporate embezzlement and learning how criminals used shell companies to launder stolen funds. I poured every ounce of my anger and my humiliation into my textbooks. I weaponized my trauma. The harder the classes became, the more aggressively I studied. As the months turned into years, my knowledge grew sharp and lethal. I learned exactly how to track a hidden wire transfer. I learned how to tear apart a fraudulent balance sheet and find the missing capital. I was no longer just the dumb kid my parents had tried to throw away. I was becoming an expert in the exact crimes they had committed. And while I was studying in the shadows, building my armor brick by brick, I kept a very close eye on the people who had thrown me to the wolves. The federal investigation that Judge Miller triggered that day in court had hit my parents like a freight train. The Financial Crimes Division of the FBI, along with the IRS, ripped through my parents' lives with absolutely zero mercy. Their bank accounts remained frozen for months. The agents combed through every single check my parents had forged and every wire transfer they had desperately pushed through my brother's accounts. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like my mother and father were going to face federal prison time for elder financial abuse and wire fraud. But I quickly learned a very bitter lesson about how the American justice system actually works for people who know how to play the game. My parents were facing absolute ruin, but they were deeply obsessed with their public image. They hired a team of ruthless, highly connected defense attorneys. They spun a massive web of plausible deniability. My father claimed he was merely acting under the confused verbal directives of his dying father. My mother played the role of the overwhelmed, grieving daughter-in-law weeping in front of the federal prosecutors, just like she had wept in front of Judge Miller. They managed to negotiate a brutal settlement behind closed doors, avoiding criminal convictions by a razor-thin margin. To keep themselves out of a federal penitentiary, they were ordered to pay back every single dollar they had stolen from my grandfather's estate, plus massive civil penalties and exorbitant legal fees. To pay the millions of dollars they owed, they were forced to take out a massive secondary mortgage, draining every last drop of equity out of their perfect suburban house. They liquidated their retirement accounts. They borrowed heavily against my father's future earnings. They financially gutted themselves just to stay out of a jail cell. But the most sickening part was not that they avoided prison. The most sickening part was that they refused to drop the facade. Even though they were secretly drowning in massive high-interest debt, paying thousands of dollars a month just to keep their heads above water, they refused to let the community see them fail. They kept the luxury cars. They continued paying the massive monthly dues at the country club. My mother still bought designer dresses and sat in the front row of the church every single Sunday acting like she was a pillar of high society. They lived in constant suffocating panic, deeply mortgaged to the banks, yet they smiled at neighborhood barbecues, pretending their wealth was infinite. They were living on a financial cliff edge, surviving on borrowed money and desperate credit card shuffling. But to the outside world, the Vance family was still untouched royalty. And then there was my brother Connor. Connor had been the one moving the stolen funds through his shell companies, but his firm had powerful lawyers who shielded him from the fallout. He played the naive young son, claiming he had simply followed his father's instructions without understanding the legal implications. Not only did Connor escape the investigation completely unscathed, but he actually thrived. He was promoted to a senior wealth manager at his downtown firm. I would occasionally see his face smiling on shiny, glossy advertisements for his company promising to help the elderly secure their retirement portfolios. The absolute hypocrisy of it made my stomach turn. He was a thief masquerading as a financial guardian. He bought a massive new house in a gated community. He married his fiancée Chloe in a wildly expensive destination wedding that my parents funded with even more borrowed money. Connor drove a brand new sports car and wore custom-tailored suits while I was still emptying trash cans and eating cold soup out of a can in my car. They had ruined my life, stolen my youth, and painted me as a monster to everyone I ever knew. And yet, they were the ones sleeping in mansions and drinking expensive champagne. It felt completely unjust. It felt like a profound cosmic failure. But I remembered the ledger. Numbers never lie. I knew their money was fake. I knew their lifestyle was built entirely on a foundation of massive, fragile debt. My parents were bleeding cash every single month just to maintain the illusion of success. Connor was reckless, arrogant, and fundamentally greedy. People like them do not change. They only learn how to hide their crimes deeper in the paperwork. I did not break under the weight of the injustice. I used it. I let the spite settle deep into my bones, hardening into something cold and permanent. I stopped feeling sorry for myself. I stopped longing for a family that never truly existed. Every time I saw a picture of Connor smirking on a billboard, I studied harder. Every time I thought about my mother smiling in church while I froze in a parking lot, I pushed myself further. I graduated from the community college at the top of my class. I transferred to a prestigious university, securing massive academic scholarships based on my flawless grades. I stopped working as a janitor and took an internship at a major accounting firm. I sat in small cubicles quietly auditing corporate tax returns, learning exactly how the wealthy attempt to manipulate the system. I earned my degrees. I passed my certification exams. I became a licensed forensic auditor specializing in tracing embezzled assets and dismantling complex financial fraud. For 10 years, I lived an incredibly disciplined, isolated life. I saved every dollar I earned. I lived in a tiny Spartan apartment, driving the same old car, buying absolutely nothing I did not need. I was hyper-focused, entirely consumed by my work. I built a reputation in the industry as a man who could find stolen money buried under mountains of corporate deception. I was relentless. I was terrifyingly good at my job because every single time I hunted down a corporate thief, I pictured my father sitting in that courtroom. 10 years passed. I turned 28. The $2.5 million trust my grandfather left me was still locked away, waiting for my 30th birthday, growing quietly in secure investments. I did not need it anymore. I was already highly successful, generating my own wealth through my forensic consulting business. I had not spoken a single word to my parents or my brother in a decade. I assumed they had forgotten about me, entirely safely insulated in their fragile bubble of debt and delusion. I assumed I would never see them again. But greed is an incredibly powerful magnet. And when people who live on fake money finally run out of credit, they always come looking for the one thing they cannot forge. They come looking for the truth. I was sitting in my downtown office reviewing a complex corporate audit when my phone suddenly rang. It was an unknown number. I answered it and heard a voice I had not heard since I was 18 years old. It was Connor, and he wanted to invite me to an anniversary party. 10 years is an incredibly long time to harbor a silent grudge. I am 28 years old now, and I am no longer the terrified 18-year-old boy shivering in a retail parking lot with exactly $80 to my name. Today, I am a senior forensic auditor at one of the most ruthless and respected financial investigative firms in Chicago. I hunt corporate thieves for a living. I track down embezzlers, I dismantle fraud rings, and I expose executives who think they can hide stolen capital in complex offshore shell companies. I tear apart their fraudulent balance sheets, and I legally ruin their lives. My colleagues think I am a relentless workaholic. They say I am cold, highly calculated, and completely devoid of human empathy. They do not understand that when I look at a forged expense report, I do not just see numbers on a spreadsheet. I see my mother weeping fake tears on a witness stand. I see my father threatening to have me arrested simply for asking for my winter coat. My career is not just a job to me. It is a daily execution of absolute justice. I live an incredibly quiet and disciplined life. I earn a massive salary, but I do not spend it on luxury items. I live in a modest apartment on the edge of the city. I drive a reliable used car that blends into the background of the highway. I hoard my wealth because poverty and betrayal taught me that money is the only real armor you can wear in this world. The $2.5 million trust my grandfather left me is still sitting in its locked account. It has grown exponentially over the past decade through aggressive compound interest and secure investments, but I have not touched a single penny of it. I do not need it. I built my own fortress entirely from scratch. I trust absolutely no one. I have no close friends to invite to my home. I do not date because every time someone smiles at me, I immediately wonder what they are trying to steal. My isolation is total, but it is also my greatest strength. I learned long ago that no one can hurt a man who needs absolutely nothing from them. I assumed my family had forgotten about me entirely. For 10 long years, I did not receive a single phone call, a single birthday card, or a single email. They were perfectly content to let me rot in the shadows while they lived their grand delusion of high society wealth. But my grandfather was right. People who live on borrowed money and fake appearances eventually run out of runway. I was sitting at my glass desk late on a Tuesday evening, tracing a complex web of fake vendor invoices for a major corporate client when my cell phone buzzed. The caller identification displayed a local area code I did not recognize. I answered the call, placing it on speakerphone without looking away from my computer screen. The voice on the other end made the blood run instantly cold in my veins. "Liam, it is Connor." The sound of my older brother's voice sent a visceral shockwave through my entire body. I stopped typing. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I did not say a word. I just sat in the quiet glow of my office, listening to him breathe into the receiver. "Hey, man." "Connor," said his voice dripping with that same artificial, charming tone he always used when he was trying to sell a bad investment. "I know it has been a really long time. Look, Chloe and I are celebrating our 5-year wedding anniversary this weekend. We are throwing a massive event at the Oak Ridge Country Club. Mom and Dad are going to be there. We were all sitting around talking the other night, and we realized how much we actually miss you. We want you to come celebrate with the family. It is time to put the past behind us and act like brothers again." I stared at the financial documents glowing on my monitor. The Oak Ridge Country Club was the exact same place my parents had stolen from my grandfather to pay their ridiculous membership dues. The absolute audacity of inviting me there of all places was staggering. I knew instantly that this was a trap. Connor did not miss me. My parents did not suddenly develop a moral conscience. You do not ignore a man for a decade, leave him to freeze in a parking lot, and then suddenly invite him to a lavish country club anniversary party just to catch up on old times. They wanted something. My immediate instinct was to hang up the phone, block the number, and go right back to my peaceful, isolated life. But the forensic auditor inside me felt a massive surge of dangerous curiosity. I wanted to see their grand illusion up close. I wanted to see what 10 years of living on stolen time and crushing debt looked like on their faces. I wanted to look at their perfect American family and read the hidden numbers behind their smiles. "Send me the details," I said, my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. I hung up the phone before he could say another word. Saturday evening arrived with a heavy, humid heat that blanketed the city. I drove my modest car up the long, winding, immaculate driveway of the Oak Ridge Country Club, passing rows of luxury European sports cars and imported utility vehicles. I handed my keys to the valet and walked up the grand stone steps. I was not wearing a thrift store jacket anymore. I wore a dark, charcoal, perfectly tailored suit that I had purchased specifically for federal court appearances. It was completely understated, but it projected absolute silent authority. I walked into the main ballroom and the visual assault of fake wealth hit me immediately. The room was dripping with excessive, desperate luxury. There were massive floral centerpieces on every table, a live jazz band playing in the corner, and waiters dressed in crisp white uniforms carrying silver trays of expensive vintage champagne. It looked exactly like the life my parents had always wanted to project to the world. I stood near the back of the room by the heavy velvet curtains, making sure I blended into the shadows. I just watched them. Connor was standing near the center of the dance floor, holding a glass of amber bourbon, laughing loudly with a group of older, wealthy-looking men. He was desperately trying to play the role of the highly successful senior wealth manager. But to my trained eyes, his smile looked incredibly tight and painfully forced. Every time a waiter walked by, Connor would loudly demand another drink, making sure everyone around him saw how comfortable he was giving orders. Next to him was his wife, Chloe. She was wearing a blindingly expensive designer gown covered in hand-stitched crystals. She had massive diamond earrings and a flashy, oversized watch that caught the light every time she moved her wrist. She was completely obsessed with her own status, constantly looking around the room to make sure people were noticing her outfit. She spoke loudly about their recent vacation to a private island, making sure to drop the names of luxury resorts into every single conversation. But I looked at the way she gripped her champagne flute. Her knuckles were white. She was performing. Then my eyes shifted across the room and found my parents. I had not seen Richard and Barbara in 10 years. The physical sight of them actually shocked me. They looked absolutely terrible. My father, Richard, had aged 20 years in a single decade. His hair was entirely gray and thinning badly at the crown. His posture, once so proud and intimidating when he threw me out of the house, was now slumped and defeated. The expensive tuxedo he wore looked a full size too big for him, as if he had lost a significant amount of weight from pure daily stress. He was clutching a drink, staring blankly at the floor while the people around him laughed. My mother, Barbara, looked even worse. Her face was heavily contoured with expensive makeup, desperately trying to hide the deep, heavy lines of pure exhaustion around her eyes and mouth. Her eyes were constantly darting around the room, tracking every single conversation, reading every whisper, trying to gauge what people thought of her. She looked exactly like a cornered animal wearing a pearl necklace. When someone approached her, she would flash a massive, brilliant smile, but the absolute second they turned their back, her face would instantly drop back into a mask of pure terror. As a forensic auditor, you learn very early on that you do not need to look at a bank statement to know when a company is going bankrupt. You just have to watch how the executives behave when they think no one is watching them. I slowly walked toward the grand open bar, keeping a considerable distance from my family. I ordered a simple glass of sparkling water and leaned against the polished mahogany counter. I watched Connor walk up to the bartender a few feet away from me. He was completely focused on impressing the men following behind him and did not notice me standing in the dim lighting. He ordered a round of top-shelf tequila shots for his friends. He pulled a heavy metal luxury credit card out of his leather wallet and slapped it onto the marble counter with a loud, arrogant thud. "Put it all on this," he told the bartender loudly, making sure the people around him heard his grand gesture. The bartender nodded and ran the heavy card through the digital point-of-sale machine. I watched the bartender's face closely. I know the exact subtle look a service worker gives when a transaction is rejected. The bartender paused, looked at the screen, and quietly leaned over the counter to speak privately to my brother. "I am sorry, sir. The card was declined," he whispered professionally, trying to save Connor from public embarrassment. Connor's face immediately flushed a dark, furious red. He snatched the metal card back, his hands trembling visibly under the warm bar lights. "Run it again," he hissed through his teeth, his charming facade instantly cracking. "The machine is broken, just run the card again." The bartender sighed and ran it a second time. Declined. Connor swore under his breath, his eyes darting around in sheer panic to see if his friends had noticed. He quickly pulled out a different credit card from a completely different bank and shoved it across the counter. The second card finally went through, but the profound damage was already done. I had seen the crack in the golden armor. A senior wealth manager throwing a lavish country club party should never have his primary credit card declined for a round of drinks. He was juggling massive debts, living paycheck to paycheck on high-interest plastic. A few minutes later, I noticed another quiet interaction that confirmed everything I suspected. I watched my father Richard get pulled aside near the kitchen doors by a man wearing a dark suit with a country club management badge. The music was loud, but I positioned myself close enough to read the body language. The manager was holding a clipboard, looking very stern. My father was holding his hands up in a defensive, pleading gesture. He was physically shrinking in front of the manager, whispering frantically and pointing toward Connor as if promising that his son would cover the bill. The manager shook his head, tapped the clipboard, and walked away, leaving my father leaning against the wall, wiping sweat from his forehead with a cocktail napkin. The picture was absolutely complete. The entire family was completely bankrupt. The perfect American family, the people who had sacrificed me to save their own reputations, were bleeding to death right in front of me. Chloe was wearing a dress bought on credit she could not afford. Connor was funding his lifestyle by constantly rotating massive balances between different banks. Richard and Barbara were dodging collection notices at the very country club where they were trying to pretend they were still wealthy. They were drowning in a suffocating ocean of debt, and they had run out of lifeboats. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, feeling an immense chilling calm wash over me. I finally understood exactly why they had broken their 10-year silence. I understood why they suddenly missed me. My 30th birthday was only 2 years away. The massive $2.5 million trust fund that the judge had locked away from them was about to become fully liquid and legally accessible to me. They were completely out of money. They were facing total absolute social and financial annihilation. And they had invited me to this party to set a trap. They were going to try to extort me one more time. But what they did not realize was that they had not invited a scared 18-year-old boy to their party. They had invited a predator. And I was more than ready to let them spring their trap, just so I could finally tear their entire world to the ground. I stayed at the anniversary party just long enough to confirm my suspicions. The lavish food tasted like ash. The live jazz music sounded like a funeral dirge for a family secretly drowning in debt. I did not say a word to anyone. I walked out the heavy brass doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club and stepped into the suffocating humidity of the summer night. I handed my ticket to the valet and waited for my unremarkable sedan to be brought around. The night air was thick and heavy. I felt a deep sense of closure. I had seen their ruin with my own eyes. I was ready to go back to my quiet apartment and never think of them again. The valet pulled my car up to the curb. I tipped him and reached for the door handle. Before my fingers could touch the metal, a hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. "Liam, wait a minute." It was Connor. He was slightly out of breath. His custom suit jacket was unbuttoned and his tie was askew. Right behind him, walking quickly out of the shadows of the parking lot, were my father Richard and my mother Barbara. They had been waiting for me to leave. They had tracked my movements all night. They flanked me, pressing me against the side of my car. There were no other guests around. The valet had retreated into his small glass booth. We were entirely alone in the dimly lit lot. "Liam, it is so incredibly good to see you," my mother said. Her voice trembled with fake emotion. She reached out and tried to touch my arm, but I stepped back immediately. The heavy lines around her eyes looked even deeper under the harsh yellow parking lot lights. She tried to project the warmth of a loving mother who had simply lost touch with her beloved son. "I missed you so much, Liam. We all did. Every single day I prayed for you." My father stepped forward. He looked incredibly frail in the harsh lighting. He coughed a dry, rattling sound and put his hand over his chest. "Son, we really need to talk," he said, his voice raspy and weak. "I know the past was difficult. I know we made terrible mistakes when you were younger. But we are a family. And right now your family is in a very desperate situation." I did not speak. I just watched them. I watched the way Connor's eyes darted nervously toward my mother's designer purse. I watched the way my father avoided making direct eye contact with me. As a forensic auditor, you learn very early that liars always struggle with what to do with their hands. My father's fingers were twitching nervously against his slacks. "I am dying, Liam," my father said. He forced a single tear to well up in his eye. "My liver is failing. The doctors say I have less than a year left to live unless I get an emergency transplant, but the insurance company is completely denying the medical claim. They say it is an experimental procedure for someone my age. They will not cover a single dime of the surgery. The out-of-pocket cost is astronomical. I do not want to die, son. I want to see my grandchildren grow up. I want to make things right with you before I am gone." Connor stepped in right on cue, playing the role of the stressed but highly responsible older brother. "And my wealth management business is taking a massive hit right now, Liam. The market has been absolutely brutal this quarter. I have all my liquid capital tied up in long-term real estate developments. I cannot access the cash to save Dad. We have leveraged everything we own. Mom and Dad took out loans to pay for the medical bills, but it is not enough. We are completely out of options. You are the only one left who can save his life." They were painting a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. 10 years ago, it might have worked perfectly. 10 years ago, I was a terrified 18-year-old boy who desperately wanted his parents to love him. But today, I was a forensic investigator who spent 10 hours a day untangling the lies of desperate, bankrupt criminals. My mother opened her expensive designer handbag. She reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on premium paper. She held them out to me, her hands shaking exactly the way a frightened mother would shake. "We know about the trust," Liam, my father, said, his voice dropping to a serious businesslike tone. "We know the judge locked the principal balance away until your 30th birthday. We know you are 28 right now. You only have 2 years left before the funds vest completely and legally to you. The trust is currently valued at nearly $3.5 million with the accrued interest." Connor reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an expensive silver pen. He held it out toward me. "We had our corporate lawyers draft this up this morning," Connor explained, pointing to the documents in my mother's hands. "It is a legally binding promissory note. It uses your future trust disbursement as collateral. All you have to do is sign it tonight. It guarantees that on the exact day of your 30th birthday, when the trust officially unlocks, half of the total funds will be automatically transferred to my corporate holding account. It is just a loan." "Liam," my mother cried, grabbing my sleeve with desperate fingers, "it is just a financial advance to save your father's life. Connor will invest the money in his firm, and he will pay you back with interest in a few short years. You will still have millions left over for yourself. You will still be incredibly wealthy. But if you do not sign this document, your father is going to die a terrible death. Please, Liam, you have to save our family. Blood is thicker than water." I looked at the silver pen in Connor's hand. I looked at the legal documents clutched in my mother's fingers. Then I looked at the man who claimed he was dying of liver failure. Let me get this absolutely straight," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. "You invited me to an obscenely expensive country club party to celebrate a wedding anniversary. You drank premium liquor all night. You wore thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. And you brought a legally binding promissory note in your handbag hoping to ambush me in the parking lot and extort me for nearly $2 million. My father's jaw tightened visibly. "It is not extortion," he snapped, losing a tiny fraction of his tragic sick man persona. "It is family duty. I gave you life. I put a roof over your head for 18 years. I turned my head and looked directly at Connor. "Your business is not taking a hit because of the market fluctuations, Connor," I said. "Your business is failing because you run a fraudulent operation. I saw your metal credit card get declined at the open bar tonight. I saw you panic when the bartender handed it back to you. Senior wealth managers do not get their primary cards declined for a round of tequila shots unless they are drowning in high-interest consumer debt." Connor's face went completely white. His mouth opened, but he had absolutely nothing to say. He looked at my parents in pure, unadulterated shock, wondering how I could possibly know that. I turned my attention back to my father. "And you do not need a liver transplant," I said, stepping closer to him. My voice was like ice cutting through the humid summer air. "People in end-stage liver failure have severe jaundice. The whites of their eyes turn yellow. They lose massive amounts of muscle mass and suffer from severe chronic fatigue. They do not drink 4 glasses of top-shelf bourbon in 2 hours at a country club mixer. The only thing failing in your life right now is your credit score." My father tried to speak, but he was completely paralyzed by the factual breakdown of his lies. "I saw the club manager corner you by the kitchen doors an hour ago." I continued, relentlessly pinning him down with the truth. "I saw you begging him for more time to pay your overdue membership fees. You are not dying of organ failure. You are just completely broke. Your house is probably leveraged to the absolute maximum. You are running out of credit cards to balance your debt. You are terrified of losing your social status, so you decided to try and steal from me one last time." The silence in the parking lot was absolute and crushing. The chirping of the summer insects seemed to amplify the heavy weight of the moment. My parents and my brother stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Their carefully constructed emotional play had just been entirely dismantled by pure logic and basic observation. They realized in that exact second that they were not talking to the vulnerable teenager they had thrown out of their house a decade ago. They were talking to a man who saw right through their hollow, pathetic souls. "I am not signing your promissory note," I said flatly. "I am not giving you a single dollar from my grandfather's trust. Not today. Not in 2 years. Not ever. You spent my entire childhood telling me I was worthless. You dragged me into a federal courtroom on my 18th birthday and tried to declare me mentally incompetent just so you could steal my inheritance. You locked me out of my own home. You told the entire town I was a dangerous drug addict. You left me to freeze in a parking lot with $80 in my pocket. And now you expect me to hand over half of my future because you cannot afford to keep playing rich at the country club. The answer is absolutely no." The mask completely slipped. The loving mother routine vanished instantly, evaporating into the humid night air. Barbara's face twisted into a mask of pure, hateful venom. She looked exactly like she did on the witness stand 10 years ago when she lied to the judge. Her eyes narrowed and she practically spit her words at me. "You are a pathetic, selfish little failure," she screamed. Her voice echoed violently across the empty asphalt, making the valet look up from his booth. "You have always been a massive disappointment to this family. We gave you everything, and you manipulated that old man into leaving you his money. You think you are so smart now. You think you are better than us because you have a little bit of cash waiting for you. You are nothing. You are a cold, heartless mistake, and you never deserved this family name." Connor stepped forward, puffing his chest out, trying to physically intimidate me. "You owe us," he growled. "You would be nothing without this family. You are going to sign that paper or we will take you back to court and sue you for the emotional damages you caused us 10 years ago." I looked at Connor and then at my mother. I felt absolutely no pain from her words. I felt no sorrow for the family I never had. I only felt a deep, satisfying confirmation that I had made the correct choice to cut them out of my life. Their greed was a bottomless pit, and I refused to throw my hard-earned peace into it. "You are absolutely right about one thing," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying absolute, unshakable authority. "I am cold. You made me this way. You taught me that the only thing that matters in this world is knowing how to read the numbers, and your numbers are currently at 0. I turned my back on them, completely dismissing their existence. I opened the door of my sedan and climbed into the driver's seat. Connor slammed his hand against my window, shouting something angry and desperate that I could not hear through the thick glass. I started the engine. I put the car in drive and pulled smoothly away from the curb. In my rearview mirror, I watched them standing together in the dim yellow light of the parking lot. They looked incredibly small, broken, and utterly desperate. They had tried to spring their final trap, and the jaws had snapped shut on their own fingers. I drove down the long, winding path of the Oak Ridge Country Club, leaving them behind in the dark to face their inevitable ruin. I knew they would not stop here. Desperate people never stop. But I also knew that my forensic investigation into their finances was only just beginning. I was going to find out exactly how Connor was funding his lifestyle, and when I did, I was going to burn their entire illusion to the ground. I woke up the morning after the country club party long before the sun rose. The confrontation in the dark parking lot played over and over in my mind. I made a pot of black coffee and sat down at my heavy oak desk inside my quiet apartment. I booted up my encrypted work terminal. I was not a scared kid anymore. I was a senior forensic auditor. My father Richard and my brother Connor had just tried to extort me for nearly $2 million using a fabricated medical emergency. I knew they were broke. I had seen it with my own eyes when Connor's credit card was declined, and when the club manager cornered my father near the kitchen doors. But in my line of work, knowing someone is broke is never enough. You have to prove exactly how they broke themselves. And more importantly, you have to prove who they are stealing from to survive. I started with the easiest targets, Richard and Barbara. I accessed the county property registry network and pulled the deed history for the large suburban house I grew up in. The trail of financial desperation was written in plain black and white on the digital screen. 10 years ago, after the judge forced them to pay back my grandfather's estate, they had taken out a massive secondary mortgage. 5 years later, they refinanced again, pulling out every single drop of equity to fund their country club dues and luxury car leases. Currently, there were 3 separate independent contractor liens filed against the property for unpaid renovation work. They had not paid their property taxes in 14 straight months. They were exactly 60 days away from a total county foreclosure. I ran a standard background check on their names through the civil court dockets. There were 4 active lawsuits from high-interest credit card companies trying to garnish my father's wages. But what about the liver transplant? My father had stood in that dark parking lot, clutching his chest, claiming he had less than a year to live. He claimed the insurance company had denied the coverage, and they desperately needed my money to save his life. I used a highly restricted legal database to check for medical bankruptcy filings or medical hardship appeals. There was absolutely nothing. I checked the state registry for major surgical funding campaigns, which are often used by people denied by standard insurance providers. Nothing. I pulled the data on his recent pharmacy accounts through a legal investigative portal I use for insurance fraud cases. My father was perfectly healthy. There were no prescriptions for anti-rejection medications or liver disease treatments. The entire story about his failing liver, the experimental surgery, the denial from the insurance company was a completely fabricated script. It was a calculated, disgusting lie designed to manipulate a son they thought was still desperate for their love and approval. I pushed my empty coffee mug aside and turned my full attention to my older brother Connor. He was the golden child, the senior wealth manager. He drove a European sports car, and his wife Chloe wore dresses that cost more than a reliable used vehicle. I pulled up the public federal regulatory filings for his boutique wealth management firm. On paper, the firm looked incredibly successful, boasting tens of millions of dollars in assets under management. But forensic accounting is not about looking at the glossy front page. It is about tracing the obscure limited liability companies buried deep in the corporate disclosures. I tracked the registration numbers for 3 specific subsidiary shell companies linked to Connor's name. All of them were registered to a tiny single-room office building in Delaware. I began cross-referencing the property records of Connor's clients against the real estate purchases made by those shell companies. A horrifying pattern emerged almost immediately across my monitors. Connor was managing retirement portfolios for dozens of elderly couples in our hometown, including several high-ranking members of my mother's church congregation. These were the exact same people who had shunned me 10 years ago when my mother spread her toxic lies about me being a drug-addicted thief. I dug into the transaction ledgers. Whenever an elderly client requested a standard monthly distribution from their retirement account, Connor did not pull the money from their actual investments. He pulled the money directly from the principal cash deposits of his newest clients. He was completely liquidating the life savings of vulnerable senior citizens and funneling the cash into his Delaware shell companies. He was using that stolen cash to pay his own massive mortgage. He was using it to buy Chloe's designer jewelry and luxury vacations. And he was quietly funneling thousands of dollars a month to Richard and Barbara to keep their suburban house out of foreclosure. My brother was not a financial genius. He was running a localized massive Ponzi scheme. He was entirely robbing the very community that worshipped my family. The sheer scale of the fraud was staggering. Connor was shuffling millions of stolen dollars every single month just to keep the entire family afloat and project an image of absolute perfection. It was an incredible twist of fate that the very people who cast me out for a crime I never committed were currently handing their life savings over to the true criminal of the family. But a Ponzi scheme is exactly like a shark. It has to constantly keep moving forward and feeding on new money, or it immediately dies. The current economic downturn had slowed his influx of new clients. The incoming cash had completely dried up. That was exactly why they had ambushed me at the anniversary party. They did not just want my money to maintain their lavish lifestyle. They absolutely needed my money to stop the Ponzi scheme from collapsing and sending Connor to a federal penitentiary. They needed my $2 million to plug the gaping hole in the client accounts before the elderly investors realized their life savings were completely gone. They were willing to steal my future to cover up their massive crimes. Knowing the truth was one thing. I needed Connor to make an undeniable legally binding mistake. I needed him to cross a line that he could never come back from. I reached out to a secure contact I had at the massive banking institution that held my frozen $2.5 million trust fund. I did not ask them to move any money. I simply placed a highly sensitive internal fraud alert on my own personal file. I directed the system to automatically trigger a silent notification to my private server if anyone attempted to query the account, run a credit check against it, or submit a loan application using the trust as collateral. The bank system would capture the digital footprint of the person making the request down to the exact physical location of the computer they used. I knew Connor was completely desperate. He had tried to get me to sign a promissory note in the parking lot, and I had walked away leaving him staring at his own ruin. A desperate man running out of time will always take the most dangerous path available to him. He was a wealth manager with access to massive financial networks. He knew how the commercial loan systems worked. He just needed collateral to secure a massive injection of cash. I left my terminal running and went to work at my corporate office, waiting for the inevitable moment when his greed would override his basic sense of self-preservation. I knew my brother better than he knew himself. I did not have to wait long. 3 days later, I was sitting in a quiet, glass-walled conference room when my encrypted terminal lit up with a high-priority red alert. I immediately locked the conference room door and opened the secure notification. A commercial bridge loan application for $1.2 million had just been submitted to a secondary mezzanine lender. The collateral listed on the entire loan application was my exact trust fund. I pulled the raw data packets from the digital submission. I traced the routing numbers and the source network. The loan application originated directly from the Internet Protocol address registered to Connor's wealth management firm. He had actually done it. Connor had taken the Social Security number and personal identification details my parents had saved from my childhood records. He had filled out a massive commercial loan application pretending to be me. He had digitally forged my signature on 20 distinct pages of complex legal documents. He falsely claimed that I was authorizing the high-interest loan and directing the $1.2 million to be deposited straight into one of his completely unregulated Delaware shell companies. It was textbook identity theft committed across state lines using a federal banking network. It was wire fraud and bank fraud on a massive federal level. It was the ultimate fatal mistake that would ensure he spent the rest of his adult life in a prison cell. Connor thought because I was his estranged younger brother, I would never monitor the credit inquiries on an account I could not touch for another 2 years. He thought because the judge had frozen the principal from me, I would be completely blind to any background financial maneuvering. He thought he was completely untouchable. He believed he could just steal the money, replace the stolen funds in his client accounts, and buy himself another year of his fake, luxurious life without anyone ever noticing the massive theft. He thought he was outsmarting the dumb kid he used to laugh at. He had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them all. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the digital application process pending on my screen. A normal person would have panicked and called the bank to cancel the fraudulent transaction to protect their identity. I did not cancel it. I let the digital trail solidify. I let the application embed itself permanently into the federal banking records. I downloaded every single page of the forged documents. I captured every timestamp, every routing code, and every digital signature. I compiled a massive secure dossier that connected his fake loan application directly to his empty shell companies and linked his shell companies directly to the missing money from his elderly clients. I also documented the recurring wire transfers from Connor's fraudulent accounts straight to Richard and Barbara's personal checking accounts, proving definitively that my parents were willingly receiving stolen funds to pay for their country club lifestyle. They were entirely complicit in the massive financial crime. The breadcrumbs had led me straight to the slaughterhouse. They thought they were hunting me. They thought they were going to drain my future just like they drained my grandfather's past. They had absolutely no idea that every single move they made was being monitored, tracked, and permanently recorded by the exact same son they had thrown into the street. The trap was now perfectly set, and it was finally my turn to lock the doors. I sat in my quiet, glass-walled office, staring at the digital footprint of my brother's massive, fatal mistake. Any normal person would have felt an immediate, overwhelming urge to confront the people who had wronged them. A younger, weaker version of myself might have printed out the forged loan application, driven straight to the Oak Ridge Country Club, and thrown the papers directly into my father's face. I could have screamed at them. I could have watched them scramble and beg right there in the lobby. I could have called the local police and had Connor arrested for simple identity theft the very same afternoon. But I was no longer a terrified 18-year-old boy looking for validation or an apology. I was a 34-year-old forensic auditor who specialized in the complete systemic dismantling of financial criminals. I did not want a brief moment of angry satisfaction. I wanted absolute, permanent destruction. I did not pick up the phone. I did not send a threatening text message. I closed my office door and initiated a complete lockdown on my secure terminal. I was going to wage a silent, invisible war against my own family, and they were not going to know they were under attack until the federal agents were already breaking down their front doors. I spent the next 48 hours meticulously compiling the most comprehensive financial dossier of my entire career. I did not sleep. I barely ate. I poured every ounce of the rage and humiliation I had carried for 12 years into building an absolutely airtight, inescapable prosecution file. I started with the foundation of Connor's crimes. I pulled every single public and private registry document connecting his boutique wealth management firm to the shell companies hidden in Delaware. I mapped out the entire architecture of his localized Ponzi scheme. I created flowcharts detailing exactly how he targeted elderly clients from my mother's church congregation. I documented the specific dates and amounts he liquidated from their retirement portfolios. Then I connected the stolen money directly to his personal lifestyle. I traced the routing numbers from the Delaware shell companies straight to the auto dealership where he leased his European sports car. I found the wire transfers that paid for his wife's outrageously expensive designer jewelry and their luxury destination wedding. I laid out the financial proof that his entire existence as a successful senior wealth manager was a completely fabricated illusion built entirely on the stolen life savings of vulnerable senior citizens. But I was not going to stop with Connor. My parents were going down with him. They had tried to lock me in a permanent legal cage to steal my future, and I was going to make sure they paid for that absolute betrayal. I dug deep into my father's banking history. I knew Richard and Barbara were deeply complicit in the theft, but I needed undeniable digital proof. I tracked the secondary flow of the stolen money. I found exactly what I was looking for. Every time my parents faced a foreclosure notice or an unpaid country club bill, Connor would initiate a wire transfer from the Delaware accounts into my father's primary checking account. My father masked these transfers by listing them as independent consulting fees, but my father had not worked as a consultant in over a decade. He was knowingly accepting stolen funds to maintain his pathetic illusion of suburban wealth. I printed the forged commercial bridge loan application. I highlighted the digital signature where Connor had attempted to legally bind my locked trust fund to a $1.2 million debt. I attached the Internet Protocol logs proving definitively that the forged application originated from his personal computer inside his downtown office. The evidence was absolutely flawless. It was a masterclass in financial investigation. There was no defense attorney on earth who could spin a plausible narrative to save them from this mountain of factual data. I printed the entire dossier and placed the thick stack of papers on my desk. It weighed nearly 5 pounds. It was the physical manifestation of 12 years of patience and suffering. It was the culmination of every long night I spent scrubbing floors as a janitor and every cold hour I spent sleeping in the back seat of my car. I rested my hand on top of the file, feeling the incredible power of absolute truth. My grandfather Harrison had told me to learn the numbers because numbers never lie. He was entirely right. The numbers had just handed me the ultimate weapon. Now I had to execute the drop. I knew the methodology had to be absolutely perfect. If I submitted the criminal complaint using my own name and identity, my parents would immediately attempt to muddy the waters. Barbara would run straight to the local authorities and cry her fake tears. She would tell them I was a deeply disturbed, estranged son pursuing a malicious personal vendetta against my successful family. Richard would hire expensive lawyers to claim the evidence was somehow biased or illegally obtained. They would use my personal involvement to delay the investigation and give Connor time to destroy the servers and hide the remaining money. I was not going to give them a single inch of breathing room. I was going to become a complete ghost. I set up a highly encrypted, untraceable digital profile using an offshore proxy network. I drafted an executive summary of the criminal activity that was completely devoid of personal emotion. I wrote it in the cold, calculated language of a senior corporate whistleblower. I outlined the exact nature of the Ponzi scheme. The specific accounts involved the total estimated value of the stolen assets and the names of the elderly victims. I attached the forged loan application as the definitive proof of immediate ongoing criminal intent. I targeted 3 specific agencies to ensure maximum uncoordinated devastation. First, I drafted a direct submission to the Enforcement Division of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC handles severe market manipulation and investment fraud. They have the absolute authority to immediately freeze broker licenses and halt trading accounts. I knew the moment they saw the evidence of a wealth manager liquidating client portfolios, they would initiate a catastrophic regulatory sweep of Connor's entire firm. Second, I prepared a package for the financial crimes section of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The SEC could take away his license, but the FBI could put him in federal prison. I specifically highlighted the interstate wire fraud, the identity theft, and the digital forgery. I made sure to emphasize my father's complicity in receiving the stolen funds across state lines, making it a sprawling federal conspiracy. The third and final drop was the most lethal. I sent the entire unredacted dossier directly to the Internal Compliance and Risk Management Board of Connor's boutique wealth management firm. Government agencies can sometimes take weeks to process new information and assemble strike teams. But private financial firms operate on pure terror when their liability is exposed. I knew the board of directors would panic the absolute second they realized one of their senior managers was running a massive Ponzi scheme under their corporate umbrella. They would instantly try to cover their own tracks by throwing Connor directly to the wolves. I sat back in my leather desk chair holding my computer mouse. The city of Chicago sprawled out beyond the massive glass windows of my office. The sun was just beginning to rise over the lake, casting a cold, bright light across the skyscrapers. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I thought about the night my mother told the judge I was going to end up dead or living on the streets in a month. I thought about my father physically blocking the door to my childhood home. I thought about the smirking golden child who believed he was completely untouchable. I clicked the mouse. The encrypted files vanished from my screen, launched into the digital void toward the 3 separate investigative bodies. The silent war was officially over. The active destruction had just begun. I poured myself a single cup of black coffee from the machine in the corner of my office. I walked back to my desk and brought up my network monitoring software. I had embedded specialized tracking pixels inside the digital documents I sent to Connor's firm. These pixels would quietly ping my secure server the moment the files were opened by the internal compliance team. I wanted to watch the exact moment the trap snapped shut. The escalation began exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes later. I was reviewing a completely unrelated audit file when the first notification flashed across my secondary monitor. Someone in the risk management department at Connor's firm had just opened the executive summary. A minute later, 3 more notifications pinged. The file was being rapidly forwarded and opened by multiple senior executives across the firm. The tracking pixels showed furious, erratic activity. I took a slow sip of my coffee, leaning forward in my chair. I could mentally picture the absolute chaos unfolding inside their corporate boardroom miles away. The compliance officers were reading the unassailable proof that their golden boy had stolen millions of dollars from vulnerable senior citizens. They were seeing the forged commercial loan documents that exposed their firm to massive federal liability. The panic would be blinding. Suddenly, my tracking software registered a massive spike in localized network commands originating from the firm's administrative hub. They were executing an emergency internal protocol. They were locking Connor's terminal. They were revoking his keycard access. They were freezing his corporate email accounts and physically securing his office to preserve the evidence for the federal authorities. The firm was amputating the infected limb before the rot could spread to the rest of the partners. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had calculated. 10 minutes after the internal lockdown was initiated, my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the glass desk. I looked down at the glowing screen. It was my father, Richard. I did not answer it. I let it ring. The vibration sent a low, steady hum through the thick glass of the desk. The screen went dark and then immediately lit up again. It was my father calling for a second time. He was desperate. He was frantic. The phone stopped ringing, and a moment later a new number flashed across the screen. It was Connor. The tension in my quiet office was absolutely electric. They did not know I was the one who had pulled the trigger. They had no idea I was the ghost who had just annihilated their entire existence. They were calling me because the walls of their grand illusion were suddenly collapsing all around them, and they had absolutely no idea why. Connor was likely standing in the hallway of his firm, surrounded by corporate security guards, demanding to know why he was being escorted out of the building. My father was probably sitting in his heavily mortgaged suburban house, receiving frantic, terrifying phone calls from Connor's lawyer. Or perhaps the secondary mezzanine lender had just notified Connor that the massive bridge loan secured by my trust fund had been flagged for severe identity fraud. Whatever the immediate trigger was, the panic had officially set in. The phone vibrated violently against the desk, sliding an inch to the left as Connor called me a second time. Then a third time. Then my mother Barbara started calling. I sat there in the absolute silence of my high-rise office, watching their names flash across the digital screen one by one. The people who had tried to erase me from the world were now desperately begging for my attention. They wanted an anchor. They wanted someone to save them from the terrifying free fall they were currently experiencing. They wanted the dumb kid they used to manipulate to pick up the phone and offer them a lifeline. I reached forward and calmly turned the phone face down on the desk, plunging the screen into darkness. I did not need to hear their voices. I knew exactly what was coming next. The Internal Compliance Board was already gathering their legal teams. The SEC investigators were already pulling the market data. The Financial Crimes Division of the FBI was already drafting the federal search warrants and coordinating with local law enforcement to orchestrate a synchronized raid. I picked up my pen and went back to work on my corporate audit. The 12 long years of waiting were finally over. I had built the perfect trap. I had placed the bait. I had handed the absolute undeniable truth to the most dangerous authorities in the country. Now all I had to do was sit back in my warm, quiet office and wait for the federal agents to kick down their luxury doors. The trap I had so carefully set took exactly 3 weeks to snap shut. Federal agencies typically move slowly when they are building a financial case. But private financial firms facing total corporate ruin move with terrifying absolute speed. The Internal Compliance Board at Connor's boutique wealth management firm had panicked the exact second they opened my anonymous dossier. They immediately fully cooperated with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. To save their own corporate charter from being completely dismantled, they handed over every server, every hard drive, and every client ledger directly to the federal authorities. They threw my brother directly under the bus, just as I knew they would. I did not have to do anything else but sit back in my quiet apartment and watch the calendar. I knew exactly when the hammer was going to fall. Connor and his wife Chloe had spent the last 6 months planning a massive, highly publicized charity gala. It was meant to be the absolute pinnacle of their fake high society lives. Chloe was the chairwoman of the event, which was ironically dedicated to raising funds for local community development. She had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen money to secure the grand ballroom at the most exclusive downtown hotel. She had hired a 50-piece jazz orchestra, imported thousands of exotic flowers, and invited every wealthy socialite, local politician, and prominent business owner in the entire city. She wanted it to be the crowning moment of their social dominance to secure their place among the absolute elite. I knew the federal agents had the gala schedule as well. Law enforcement always prefers a quiet morning arrest to avoid a scene, but financial crimes divisions often make brutal exceptions when a suspect is considered a massive flight risk with access to offshore capital. Or perhaps the federal prosecutors simply wanted to send a very loud, very public message to any other wealth manager thinking about stealing from vulnerable senior citizens. Either way, the stage was perfectly set for the most spectacular public humiliation imaginable. I did not attend the charity gala in person. I did not need to. The event was being heavily covered by the local lifestyle press, and several local news stations were live streaming the opening speeches directly on their social media pages. I sat in the quiet comfort of my dark apartment holding a single cup of black coffee, watching the live high-definition feed on my large computer monitor. The grand ballroom was absolutely blinding with camera flashes and heavy crystal chandeliers. Chloe was standing at the podium wearing a custom-made silk gown covered in hand-stitched crystals that probably cost more than a reliable car. She was smiling radiantly, soaking in the absolute adoration of the wealthy crowd. She spoke passionately into the microphone about the importance of giving back to the community, entirely oblivious to the fact that her husband had literally robbed that exact same community blind to pay for the stage she was standing on. Connor was standing right beside her. He wore a crisp white tuxedo jacket looking like the absolute picture of modern American success. He was beaming, waving to the men he played golf with at the country club. The illusion was completely flawless. It was the exact same perfect illusion my parents had used to destroy my life 12 years ago in that probate courtroom. But grand illusions absolutely shatter when they finally meet the cold, hard reality of the law. Right as Chloe stepped back and Connor stepped up to the microphone to deliver his keynote address, the heavy oak double doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open violently. The live stream camera panned slightly, catching the sudden wave of confusion rippling through the back rows of the audience. The jazz orchestra abruptly stopped playing mid-song. The clinking of expensive silverware against fine china completely ceased. The silence that fell over the massive room was immediate and suffocating. 24 federal agents wearing dark suits and heavy tactical vests, clearly displaying the letters FBI and IRS across their backs, marched into the ballroom in perfect synchronization. They did not pause to answer questions from the hotel staff. They moved with absolute terrifying authority straight down the center aisle, pushing past the tables of bewildered socialites. Connor froze at the podium. I watched his face closely on the monitor. I saw the exact second his brain processed what was happening. The arrogant, smug smile completely melted away, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked wildly at the side exits, calculating if he could run. But federal agents had already secured every single door in the massive building. The lead agent walked straight up the carpeted steps of the stage. He did not care about the cameras. He did not care about the wealthy guests in their evening gowns. He walked right up to my brother, grabbed him hard by the shoulder, and spun him around. The sound of the microphone picking up the physical scuffle echoed loudly through the massive ballroom. I could hear the federal agent clearly reading Connor his Miranda rights while forcefully pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of the steel handcuffs closing around my brother's wrists was the loudest sound in the entire room. Chloe began screaming hysterically. She grabbed the agent's arm, demanding to know what they were doing, screaming that they were ruining her perfect night and demanding they let her husband go. A secondary agent firmly pulled her back, warning her loudly that she would be arrested for obstructing a federal officer if she touched him again. She collapsed onto the stage, crying uncontrollably, ruining her expensive designer makeup. The crowd of wealthy elites sat in absolutely stunned silence. People were pulling out their smartphones, recording the entire humiliating spectacle. The golden child, the senior wealth manager, the man who had stolen my youth and tried to steal my future, was being physically dragged off the stage in chains in front of the entire city. The cameras followed him as the agents marched him back down the center aisle, performing the ultimate perp walk. His head was down, his shoulders slumped, completely stripped of his fake dignity and his hollow power. But the federal sweep was incredibly coordinated, and the absolute destruction did not stop at the downtown hotel. At the exact same moment, Connor was being shoved into the back of a federal tactical vehicle. My parents were waking up to their own absolute nightmare in the wealthy suburbs. I had provided the authorities with flawless digital documentation proving that Richard and Barbara had knowingly received hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen funds. They were not innocent bystanders. They were active conspirators who used stolen money to avoid foreclosure and pay their exorbitant country club dues. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division does not knock politely when they are executing a seizure warrant for stolen federal funds. According to the police reports and the neighborhood gossip that quickly flooded the local internet networks, a convoy of black tactical vehicles surrounded my parents' pristine suburban house just as the sun was coming up. They blocked the immaculate driveway and swarmed the perfect green lawn. My father, Richard, opened the front door in his expensive silk robe, only to find a dozen armed federal agents standing on his porch with a battering ram. They breached the house immediately. They did not just arrest my father for his active part in the massive wire fraud conspiracy. They executed a total and complete asset forfeiture. Because my parents had commingled the stolen money with their personal finances to hide the trail, the government had the absolute legal right to seize everything that had been purchased or maintained with those illicit funds. The agents dragged my father out onto the front lawn in handcuffs, placing him in the back of a waiting cruiser. My mother Barbara ran out the front door screaming and crying, begging the neighbors for help. But the neighbors simply stood on their own lawns, holding their morning coffee cups, watching in absolute shock as the Vance family was completely dismantled. The federal agents began carrying heavy boxes of financial records out the front door. A massive commercial tow truck backed into the driveway and hitched up my father's luxury SUV, pulling it away as seized criminal evidence. They took my mother's expensive jewelry. They took the artwork off the walls. They seized the computers and the bank records. The federal government literally stripped their house bare while the entire affluent neighborhood watched the humiliating spectacle in complete silence. The true ruin, however, was not just financial or legal. The absolute true ruin was the total social annihilation of the Vance family name. My mother had spent her entire adult life carefully cultivating her image as a pillar of high society. She had used her powerful position on the community church board to completely destroy my reputation when I was 18 years old. She had convinced an entire congregation that I was a drug-addicted thief simply to cover her own tracks and steal my grandfather's money. But high society is incredibly fickle, and church communities built entirely on appearances are the fastest to turn on their own when a massive scandal hits. The news of the horrific elder fraud ring completely dominated the local television networks by noon that very same day. The reporters stood outside the downtown hotel and outside my parents' suburban home, broadcasting the terrible details of the Ponzi scheme to the entire state. The news anchors detailed exactly how Connor had targeted vulnerable senior citizens, liquidating their life savings to fund his lavish lifestyle and prop up his parents' failing finances. The names of the victims were released in the massive federal indictment. Several of those victims were elderly members of my mother's own church congregation. The absolute hypocrisy was staggering, and the community reaction was immediate and merciless. The church board convened an emergency meeting that same afternoon. They did not just remove my mother from her vice president position. They formally and publicly excommunicated Richard and Barbara from the congregation entirely. The pastor, the exact same man who had locked me out of his office 12 years ago, claiming I was a dangerous sinner, released a public statement condemning my parents' actions and offering desperate prayers for the elderly victims they had robbed. The people who had blindly believed my mother's lies, the people who had crossed the street to avoid me when I was a struggling teenager sleeping in my car, now turned their absolute disgust onto my parents. The phones in my parents' empty, echoing house began ringing off the hook, with angry, terrified neighbors demanding their life savings back. The Oak Ridge Country Club acted with the exact same ruthless speed. The club management had already been deeply tired of my father's late payments and desperate excuses for months. The exact moment the federal indictment hit the local news channels, the club board permanently revoked their family membership. They sent a formal legal letter to the house banning Richard, Barbara, Connor, and Chloe from ever stepping foot on the property again. The grand illusion was completely shattered. There was no more fake wealth. There were no more designer dresses or open bars. There was only the harsh, terrifying reality of massive federal indictments and total absolute public disgrace. I sat at my desk in my quiet apartment and watched the news coverage for hours. I watched the reporters dissect the mechanical details of the Ponzi scheme, I watched the financial experts explain how the federal government was going to liquidate every single asset the family owned to pay back the stolen retirement funds. I felt a profound sense of absolute peace. I had not laid a single hand on them. I had not yelled in a parking lot. I had not threatened them. I simply gathered the truth and handed it to the people who could actually do something about it. I used the exact same legal system they had tried to use against me, but I used it with absolute precision and undeniable facts. They had tried to bury me when I was a teenager, but they forgot that seeds grow best in the dark. They had underestimated my patience, and they had entirely underestimated my grandfather, who had given me the single tool I needed to read the numbers and track their crimes. The trap had closed perfectly, completely crushing the monsters who had built it. But I knew the story was not completely over. Federal investigations take time to process, and desperate people facing decades in prison will always try to find one last miracle. I knew they were going to come looking for me because my 30th birthday, the day my massive trust fund finally unlocked, was rapidly approaching. And I knew they were going to beg. 12 years is a long time when you are waiting for justice. On the morning of my 30th birthday, I did not throw a party. I did not invite my coworkers out for drinks or celebrate. I woke up at exactly 5 in the morning, put on my best tailored charcoal suit, and drove my unassuming sedan into the downtown financial district. The city of Chicago was just waking up as I pulled into the private underground parking garage of the massive federal bank. Today was the day. The conditional lock that Judge Miller had placed on my grandfather's trust fund had officially expired at exactly midnight. The money was finally mine. I sat in a completely silent glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor overlooking the bright blue water of the lake. A senior wealth manager wearing a very expensive tie slid a thick stack of finalized transfer documents across the polished mahogany table. He explained the math to me in a very respectful and quiet tone. The original $2.5 million had not just been sitting stagnant for 12 long years. Thanks to aggressive compound interest and a massive booming market, the principal balance had grown to just over $4.8 million. Every single penny of it was now fully liquid and completely under my absolute legal control. I picked up the heavy, expensive pen they provided and signed my name on the final line of the transfer agreement. I did not feel a sudden rush of wild euphoria. I just felt an incredibly deep, profound sense of absolute peace. The financial armor my grandfather had promised me was finally completely forged. I shook the senior banker's hand, took my leather briefcase, and walked to the elevator. I was 30 years old, entirely self-made, and legally a multimillionaire. The bright afternoon summer sun hit my face as I walked out of the heavily air-conditioned bank lobby. I headed toward the open-air surface parking lot where I had parked my car earlier that morning. The oppressive summer humidity was thick and heavy, making the air feel hard to breathe. I was already mentally reviewing a complex corporate audit I needed to finish later that afternoon. I hit the unlock button on my key fob. The headlights of my sedan flashed briefly in the distance. As I got closer, my footsteps suddenly slowed to a complete halt. There were 3 people standing directly in front of my car, physically blocking my path to the driver's side door. My mind instantly processed their faces, but it took me a full second to truly recognize them. It had been 2 years since the massive federal raid had completely annihilated their lives. 2 years since the FBI dragged my older brother out of his lavish charity gala in handcuffs and the IRS seized my parents' pristine suburban mansion. I had watched their total public ruin unfold on the local news networks, but seeing them in person was a completely different and shocking experience. They did not look like the wealthy, arrogant family that had tried to destroy me in a probate courtroom 12 years ago. They looked like absolute ghosts. My father Richard was standing near the driver's side door. He was wearing a faded gray polo shirt that was severely frayed at the collar and cheap loose-fitting denim jeans. His posture was completely broken. His shoulders were hunched forward as if he carried an invisible crushing weight on his back at all times. His hair was entirely white, unkempt, and thinning badly. The man who used to scream at me for leaving fingerprints on his shiny luxury SUV was now leaning against my used car with a look of pure, terrifying desperation in his dark, sunken eyes. My mother, Barbara, was standing right next to him. The physical transformation was absolutely staggering. She used to spend hours perfectly contouring her face and selecting expensive designer dresses to impress her wealthy church congregation. Now she wore a plain oversized sweater and cheap, worn-out athletic shoes. Her face was gaunt and deeply lined with heavy dark circles under her eyes. The fake high society smile she used to weaponize against the world was completely gone. It was replaced by a permanent look of terrified exhaustion. And then there was Chloe, my sister-in-law. She used to drip in genuine crystals and brag loudly about private island vacations to anyone who would listen. Now she stood near the front bumper holding a cracked imitation leather purse. Her expensive blonde highlights had grown out, leaving her hair entirely dull and flat against her pale face. She looked absolutely miserable, trembling slightly in the sweltering summer heat. My brother Connor was nowhere in sight. The reason for his complete absence was exactly why they were standing in front of my car on the exact day of my 30th birthday. I stopped 5 feet away from them, holding my briefcase firmly in my right hand. I did not say a single word of greeting. I just let the absolute tense silence stretch out, forcing them to make the first move. They shifted nervously, looking at each other before Chloe finally broke down. She took a step forward, tears already streaming rapidly down her pale cheeks. "Liam, please, you have to listen to me," Chloe sobbed, her voice cracking violently in the quiet parking lot. Connor is in a federal holding facility. They completely denied his bail hearing yesterday. The public defender they assigned to him is totally useless and overwhelmed. The federal prosecutors are pushing for a 20-year mandatory sentence in a maximum security prison for the multiple counts of wire fraud and the massive Ponzi scheme. He is absolutely terrified, Liam. He is not going to survive inside a place like that. We are completely out of money. The federal government seized absolutely everything we owned. I am working 2 separate minimum wage shifts just to afford a terrible tiny apartment in a bad neighborhood. We need a massive legal defense fund to fight the federal charges and get him a reduced sentence. We know today is your birthday. We know the trust fund finally unlocked this morning. You have millions of dollars sitting right there in the bank. Please, Liam, you are his brother. You have to write a check to a private defense firm right now. You have to save my husband. I stared at her completely unmoving and entirely silent. I remembered the exact way she had looked down her nose at me when I was a struggling janitor sweeping floors at the community college. I remembered how eagerly she had spent the life savings of vulnerable elderly victims to fund her ridiculous vanity. She was not crying for the innocent people Connor had mercilessly robbed. She was crying because she was finally facing the severe, terrifying consequences of her own absolute greed. Before I could even formulate a response to Chloe, my mother suddenly pushed past her and did something I never thought I would witness in my entire life. Barbara, the former vice president of the prestigious community church board, the woman who had proudly called me a useless parasite, dropped completely to her knees on the dirty concrete parking lot. She grabbed the fabric of my suit trousers, sobbing so loudly her entire frail body physically shook. "Liam, please have mercy on us," she wailed, gripping my leg with desperate shaking fingers. The bank took our beautiful house. They took everything we ever owned in the world. We are living in a filthy roach-infested motel 2 towns over, just trying to survive. We do not have money for decent food. Your father is incredibly sick from the constant daily stress. All of our wealthy friends from the church totally abandoned us. No one will even answer our phone calls anymore. We lost our entire world, Liam. We know we were wrong all those years ago. We know we made terrible, unforgivable decisions when you were 18, but blood is thicker than water. You are my son. You are my flesh and blood. You have more money than you could ever spend in a lifetime now. Just buy our house back from the bank so we have a place to live. Just give us a tiny fraction of what you have so we can survive this nightmare. We are begging you on our hands and knees." My father stepped forward, tears leaking from his tired red eyes. He reached out an unsteady, trembling hand toward me. "Son, please," he whispered, his voice breaking completely into a pathetic whimper. "I am so deeply sorry for what we did to you in that courtroom. I am so sorry for throwing you out of the house and abandoning you. We were desperate and stupid. Just help us out of this hole. Just write us a check today and we will never bother you again. Please save your family." I looked down at my mother, crying hysterically on the dirty concrete. I looked at my father, begging like a broken stray dog in the street. I looked at Chloe, weeping endlessly for a husband who was going to spend the absolute best years of his life locked in a federal cage. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering anger. I felt the pure, clean coldness of absolute, unyielding justice. I stepped back forcefully, forcing my mother to release her desperate grip on my pants. I straightened my suit jacket and looked directly into my father's hollow eyes. "You are exactly right about one thing," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper that cut easily through their loud, pathetic sobbing. "I have exactly $4.8 million sitting in a fully liquid account right upstairs. I have the absolute power to hire the best criminal defense attorney in the entire country for Connor. I have the power to buy your suburban house back in cash this very afternoon. I could fix your entire ruined lives with a single signature on a single check." I paused for a long, deliberate moment, letting the reality of my absolute supreme power wash over them completely. Their eyes widened with a tiny, desperate, agonizing flash of pure hope. "But you taught me a very important legal and financial lesson on my 18th birthday. I continued staring at them with absolute freezing ice in my eyes. "You sat in a federal probate courtroom and told a judge I was too erratic and completely incapable of handling wealth. You swore on a holy Bible that giving me money would be a terrible, devastating mistake that would destroy a perfectly good future." I pressed the unlock button on my key fob. The car doors clicked open, echoing loudly in the quiet, sun-baked lot. I opened my driver's side door and looked back at them one final time, watching the tiny, pathetic flash of hope completely die in their eyes as they realized exactly what I was doing. "You are all far too unstable," I said, echoing their exact words with flawless, cruel precision. "I would not want to burden you with my money. It might ruin your future." I got into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy metal door shut, locking it instantly. My mother screamed my name, throwing her hands against the reinforced glass window. My father fell to his knees beside her on the hot pavement, completely crushed by the final, undeniable truth. I started the engine, feeling the low, powerful hum of the vehicle. I put the car in drive and pressed the gas pedal down hard. I drove out of the parking lot without ever looking in the rearview mirror, leaving the people who had tried to bury me choking on my exhaust. I was entirely free and I was never looking back. I drove away from that parking lot, and I never saw my parents or my brother in person again. The federal wheels of justice grind incredibly slowly, but they grind with absolute precision. 6 months after my 30th birthday, Connor stood in a federal courtroom in downtown Chicago. He was wearing a shapeless orange prison jumpsuit that completely swallowed his previously perfectly tailored frame. He did not look like a golden child anymore. He looked completely hollow. He pled guilty to 17 counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and elder financial exploitation. The federal judge did not show him a single ounce of the mercy he had begged for. The judge looked at the massive, undeniable trail of stolen retirement funds and sentenced my brother to 14 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Connor is currently sitting in a concrete cell, stripped of his expensive watches, his luxury cars, and his arrogant pride. He spends his days following strict schedules dictated by prison guards entirely removed from the high society lifestyle he stole to maintain. Chloe did not even attend the sentencing hearing to say goodbye to him. The absolute second the federal agents seized her designer wardrobe and froze her personal bank accounts, her fierce devotion to her husband completely evaporated into thin air. She filed for a rapid divorce while Connor was still sitting in a county holding cell awaiting his initial trial. She cited irreconcilable differences and completely abandoned him, moving back in with her own parents across the country. The grand, lavish destination wedding they had thrown using stolen money turned into a spectacular, highly publicized legal annulment. She wiped her hands clean of the family name the moment the credit card stopped working. My parents, Richard and Barbara, faced an even more quiet and pathetic ruin. Because the federal government seized their suburban house and liquidated every single asset they possessed to pay back the elderly victims, they were left with absolutely nothing. The proud, wealthy suburban socialites who once mocked me for sleeping in my car were suddenly entirely homeless in their late 60s. They were forced to pack whatever meager basic belongings the government allowed them to keep into cardboard boxes. They moved to a tiny rundown one-bedroom apartment in a decaying industrial town 2 states away, where rent was cheap enough to cover with a single government check. They survive entirely on a small monthly Social Security payment. There are no more country club dinners where my father can pretend to be a successful business consultant. There are no more luxury vehicles sitting in a pristine driveway. There are no more prestigious church board meetings where my mother can sit in the front row wearing designer dresses and judge the people around her. They live in total isolation and grinding poverty. The community they tried to impress for decades forgot their names the absolute moment their bank accounts were frozen. The beautiful illusion they sacrificed their own son to protect is completely dead. I heard through a distant mutual acquaintance that my father's health actually is failing now, not from a fake liver disease, but from the heavy, crushing daily stress of absolute poverty. My mother spends her days sitting in a cramped apartment watching television, entirely cut off from the glamorous world she loved more than her own child. Many people ask me what I did with the $4.8 million. When you suddenly gain access to that kind of staggering wealth, at 30 years old, the temptation to live exactly like the people you defeated is incredibly strong. I could have bought a massive luxury penthouse overlooking the lake. I could have bought a heated garage full of imported sports cars and ordered custom-tailored suits to prove to the world that I had finally won. I could have flaunted my victory and rubbed my financial success in the faces of every single person who doubted me back in my hometown. But I remembered what that kind of shallow arrogance did to my family. I remembered how the desperate need for status had turned my parents into monsters and my brother into a federal criminal. Wealth is not a weapon to be used to make other people feel small. True wealth is absolute freedom and absolute security. I kept my modest apartment on the edge of the city. I kept my reliable used sedan. I took a small portion of the trust fund and opened my own independent financial advocacy firm in the heart of the business district. I did not want to work for corporate giants anymore, making rich people even richer. I wanted to take the exact skills I had honed over 12 brutal years and use them to protect people who could not protect themselves. My firm provides completely free forensic accounting and legal auditing services for victims of elder financial abuse and conservatorship fraud. Every single day, I sit across my glass desk from terrified senior citizens who have had their life savings stolen by greedy relatives or manipulative financial advisors. I listen to their stories and I see my grandfather Harrison in their faces. I sit with young adults who have been unfairly trapped in legal guardianships by abusive parents trying to control their inheritance, just like my parents tried to do to me. I take their cases entirely for free. I use my grandfather's money to hire the best probate lawyers and the most aggressive private investigators in the state. We rip open the fraudulent bank records. We trace the hidden wire transfers through complex offshore shell companies. We walk into county courthouses and we dismantle the thieves exactly the same way I dismantled my own brother. Every time I hand a recovered bank check back to a weeping grandmother or help a young man break free from a toxic legal conservatorship, I feel the profound heavy weight of my grandfather's legacy. He built his wealth with honest, grueling labor, and I am making absolutely sure that his money is used to defend the exact kind of people my family tried to destroy. Late at night, when the office is completely empty and quiet, I still open the bottom drawer of my desk and pull out the vintage leather ledger my grandfather left me. The pages are yellowed and the binding is falling apart, but the message he wrote on the inside cover remains incredibly clear. They will use appearances to blind people. Learn to read the numbers. Numbers never lie. I used to look at that ledger while sitting in the dark supply closet during my midnight janitorial shifts, and I would feel an overwhelming sense of bitter injustice. For years, I honestly believed that Judge Miller had punished me that day in court. I believed that locking my massive trust fund away until my 30th birthday was a cruel and unfair sentence. I spent 12 years fighting through extreme poverty and exhaustion, thinking I had been robbed of my youth by a legal technicality. I resented the judge for making me suffer while my brother drove sports cars and lived in a mansion. But looking back now, with the clarity of time and survival, I finally understand the absolute brilliance of the judge's decision. He did not punish me at all. He handed me the ultimate unbreakable shield. If the judge had given a terrified 18-year-old boy $2.5 million in liquid cash, my parents would have never stopped hunting me. They would have tied me up in endless, frivolous civil lawsuits, draining my resources with massive legal fees. They would have hired private investigators to track my every move. They would have manipulated my guilt and my desperate, unhealed desire for a real family to slowly bleed me dry. I would have been a rich kid, constantly looking over my shoulder, paralyzed by paranoia and emotional extortion. The money would have ruined me. Instead, the 12-year lock on my inheritance forced me into exile. It forced me to hit absolute rock bottom and discover exactly what I was made of. Sleeping in my car and scrubbing toilets taught me the true value of a single dollar. It stripped away my naivety and my weakness. It gave me the terrifying, relentless motivation to study forensic accounting and build a mind that could completely deconstruct complex financial crimes. The 12 years of suffering were not a punishment. They were a necessary, brutal forge. By the time I turned 30 and the millions finally unlocked, I was no longer a vulnerable target. I was an apex predator in the financial world. I was a man who knew exactly how to track stolen money and exactly how to send thieves to federal prison. My family tried to spring their final trap on a boy who no longer existed. They thought they could manipulate me with fake tears and false medical emergencies because they still viewed me as the weak teenager they had kicked to the curb. They did not realize that the 12 years of isolation had turned me into a weapon perfectly designed to destroy them. The judge gave me the time I desperately needed to grow the armor that would ultimately save my life. My grandfather gave me the financial foundation to ensure I would never have to answer to anyone ever again. I built my life from the absolute bottom of a frozen parking lot, and I built it on a foundation of absolute, undeniable truth. They tried to bury me when I was 18, but they did not realize my grandfather gave me the shovel to dig my way out. If you have ever had your own family try to tear you down for their own gain, hit that like button, drop a comment, and tell me how you rebuilt your life when everyone counted you out. And do not forget to subscribe for more stories about surviving the people who are supposed to love you.